Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. Welcome back to the channel and to my humble home studio. The human voice is perhaps the most expressive musical instrument we have, and vocals span across so many different musical genres that it's important for us as music producers to know how to produce vocals effectively. That's why I've put together this video to share 12 tips for vocal production that I've picked up over my many years of producing music and vocalists. So without spending any more time talking to the camera like this, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started with these vocal production techniques. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to talk about better vocal production, and I may have jumped the gun a little bit getting into the screen share right away because the first tip I have for you is to record your vocals as dry as possible. There is a reason why a lot of overdubbed vocals are recorded in vocal booths. They are acoustically dead, they've got a lot of treatment in them, and the vocal is not interacting so much with the environment around it, and so we get basically a direct vocal signal without any real sense of a room around it. So you can hear my voice in my room right now. It's getting picked up by this lavalier mic, but there is some interaction between my voice and the walls, even though I do have acoustic paneling up. My voice is also bouncing off of my visual monitors and back at me, off the desk and back at me. And so while this is a pretty decent recording environment, all things considered, it could be improved if I had a proper vocal booth with real, complete acoustic dampening. That being said, most of us are recording in home studios, and so we have to make some concessions in some ways. I would encourage you to invest in some nice acoustic treatment like I have on my walls, but also some soft furniture if you have it around, whether that's curtains or a couch, or I've even seen people use mattresses inside the rooms in order to achieve some amount of acoustic dampening to get drier vocal takes. I've also seen people convert closets into vocal booths with nice blankets on the walls and just a tight acoustic space without a whole lot of reflections off of the walls in order to get a better vocal sound right off the bat. Another thing worth mentioning is that condenser microphones are typically more sensitive than dynamic microphones, especially in the top end where there's a lot of pinging going around, especially in untreated acoustic environments. And so if you're fairly far off from an ideal recording environment for dry vocals, I would suggest investing in a nice dynamic microphone, something like an SM7B, before perhaps investing in a proper large diaphragm condenser microphone, which is what you would typically see on vocals in a professional studio. So tip one, in typical fashion, is to get it right at the source, and this often means getting the driest vocal signal possible, especially if you don't have a nice acoustic room in a well thought out studio to record in. All right, now hopping into Logic Pro for real, the second tip I have for you is to utilize comping on vocals, and in some instances, multing. So comping is the creation of composite tracks. So for example, I may have had 5 or 6 different takes of this first verse vocal right here. Let's say I have 2 takes if I unmute this track, and comping would be to create a new track, which would be the vocal verse, and then to choose the best parts of each of these takes and combine them together into a proper composite track. That way we get the best of whatever takes we have available to us, and we can piece together the most perfect vocal take available to us. Again, as I said in the previous tip, it's always best to get everything right at the source, but when we get multiple takes of a performance, it's often the case with vocals, especially where there's some space in between the vocal lines, that we can actually mix and match in order to get the best vocal take possible. And so, for example, if I was to listen through just this verse right here. Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone. This is just a production session, so I could then listen to the second take. Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone. Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone. And so I think I like this first one better for these two. So I stare at my phone. And I would go through each of these, and let's say this take right here was better than this one. I could chop this up, bring that up there for the composite take. And I said I preferred the first 2 from this vocal. So I could take this part of it and bring that up to the composite track right here. And I would go through and make sure that I went through all of these different takes. In this case, there's only 2 in this example. And just make sure that I'm choosing the best takes for the composite track in order to get the best vocal possible. Now, when it comes to multing, that is not nearly as important, but that would be the case where, say I had this verse right here acting as the main vocal, and then there was one section of the vocal that I wanted other effects on. I could simply create a duplicate track, cut out, for example, those last two takes that I wanted different effects on, and then I could process this channel differently than this channel in order to get those different effects. And what this does is it saves me from having to automate different effects processes on and off, or to automate the parameters within different effects processes in order to get those different effects on this track. So not nearly as important as comping, but I did want to add it into this tip for better vocal production. So let's clean things up here briefly, bring that back down. I'm actually going to go back and mute this one and move on to tip 3, which is time aligning our background vocals. And so let's go to a section where there's a lot of background vocals. For example, the second verse has some right here. And so there's a 3-way vocal right here, and I'll actually bring these tracks up so that we can better align them. I'm gonna drag those up to the lead vocal just for the time being. And if I play these all back, there are little timing discrepancies between them that in some mixes we would want, and in other mixes we would want better time alignment to help thicken them up and make them sound a bit more professional. And so if we have a quick listen here, just the vocals.
I'm catching up on laughs.
I have an instance where there's a little syllable before getting into the background vocal here, the harmonies.
I'm catching up on laughs.
And so I would cut right here and right here, and actually mute these just so that we are focusing in on the lead vocal and the 3 background vocals in this case. And then there are several ways we can go about adjusting the timing of these background vocals to align them to the lead vocal. I do have a video going into detail on each of those. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. But the fastest way to do it is to utilize a great little plugin called the VocAlign Ultra, and that is by Synchro Arts. So let's open that up. And what this does is it takes a sidechain guide track. So we will choose the sidechain up here to be Vox verse 3_2. And then the dub, we will capture the audio going into this. So this is Vox verse adlib 4_2, which is right here in the mixer. And I'll actually copy that over to the other 2 tracks. And then I will open these up and capture everything. Forgive me if I'm going a little bit fast here. And then I'll play this back and we will capture audio for each of these tracks right here, and also the sidechain or guide track, which is this Vox verse right here, the lead vocal.
Catching up on laughs.
Easy peasy. This is going to populate, and then if I take this one as an example and zoom in, you can see the guide track, which is the lead vocal. You can see the dub track, which is the harmony in this case, or the background vocal. And then down here, we can see the output. So in the output, the yellow is the resulting output signal, and then the blue outline is what the guide track is. And so you can see there are slight differences in timing between the dub track and the output. And this basically shifts time stretches, time compresses the audio going into this plugin in order for it to be better aligned with the guide track. And so with VocAlign going on each of these tracks, this is what we have.
Catching up on laughs.
So much tighter than it was originally. Here's it without, and then I'll play it back to back with VocAlign on.
Catching up on laughs. Catching up on laughs.
So a little tighter, a little thicker, and a little, dare I say, more professional for the vocal production of this song. This won't apply to every one of your songs. Sometimes a looser background vocal is more appropriate. But if you are into vocal production and you have a lot of background vocals that you want to time align to the lead vocal, or any other vocal for that matter, I would highly recommend getting VocAlign. In this case, I have the Ultra version, but there's also the Project version that you can invest in if you'd like to as well. I'll leave a link to this plugin and all the other plugins we're going to be using in this training in the description box down below. All right, moving on to technique or tip number 4, I have doubling our harmonies. This can either be for double tracking at the tracking stage, or alternatively, we can utilize plugins for that. So you saw there that these harmonies are already doubled. In this case, they're actually tripled. And I have 5 panned to the center, and then 4 panned all the way to the left, 6 panned all the way to the right. And in the case of this mix, I actually doubled up all of my harmonies. So if we go through, you see that these are doubled, those are tripled as we just saw, and these are doubled over here as well. And so we can have a listen to this as well.
I hope I don't see you see.
So those are doubled, These are double.
Guns, they hate all guns. But now
So those haven't been time aligned or anything like that, nor have they been tuned. We will get to that shortly as well. But here I just want to talk about the importance, or at least the technique, of doubling our harmonies and our background vocals, and then utilizing panning to get some width for the background vocals, make them sound bigger, or even as if multiple people are performing them. And by panning them away from the center, we also give more room to the lead vocal, which is almost always panned directly to the center. So for example, if we go to the last line right here, we have this doubled harmony right there. One of them is hard panned all the way left, the other all the way right. And then the lead vocal up here is directly to the center.
a cover love that'll never last.
And so that gives us some more width and also makes more room for the lead vocal while also providing that background and that harmony to emphasize the line being performed. Now, scrolling down here, we see that we have two different harmonies
A cover love that'll never last.
with two different performances. If I was only to have one of these, let's say I only had this one,
A cover love that'll never last.
there is another plugin I really like using. It's just a simple vocal doubler. There are plenty of them on the market. My preferred one is the Waves Doubler, a very apt name, but I can go up here, Doubler 2 Mono to Stereo. And then this is going to produce the double tracking effect, which we will get to in the next tip. But basically it is doubling the vocal performance and giving us two or more different signals that have very similar audio content, but different enough for it to sound nice and wide or nice and deep or however we want it to be. So I opened up this Doubler 2 from Waves and I have the direct signal right here. I'll actually get rid of that because we have this panned to the center. And now in the Doubler 2, we have two voices, voice 1 and voice 2. And you can see here in the panoramic view and down here in this box that we have one panned to -45, that is all the way to the left. We have two panned all the way to the right at +45. We have their gains turned down -6, so that in a perfect world, if they were combined, they would be at the same level as the signal going in. And then we have delays right here, so we are delaying the signals. Voice 1 is being delayed 9.4, voice 2 is being delayed 23.7 milliseconds. I believe these are the stock settings, if I'm not mistaken. We have feedback for those delays if we'd like it, and then we also have detuning right here, along with depth and rate for detuning modulation. So I have +6 cents detune on voice 1, -6 cents on voice 2. And alone, this is what this doubler sounds like. I will play without and then with.
Cover love that'll never last. Cover love that'll never last.
So it effectively sounds as if we double tracked the vocal and we have it nice and time aligned. In my opinion, it's not as good as true double tracking where we would record the vocal performance once and then record it again and mix them together, but it does give us that same sense that we are doubling the vocal, and especially when we have them panned hard left and right, we can really take advantage of the doubling effect here.
Cover love that'll never last. Cover love that'll never last.
The more we detune, the more we can separate them, but also the more out of tune they get.
Cover love that'll never last. 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 Cover love that'll never last.
So we can mess around with these settings a little bit to get exactly what we want. And then if we mix that with just the lead vocal,
A cover love that'll never last. A cover love that'll never last.
and without.
A cover love that'll never last.
And so when it's panned right up the center without any doubling, it almost competes with the lead vocal. And then when I have this on and it's spread to the left and right, then it sort of hugs that lead vocal and acts more so as a background or supportive role.
A cover love that'll never last. A cover love that'll never last.
So definitely an upgrade versus just having a single one right there. And then in the context of the mix with the doubler on
A cover love that'll never last.
and off.
A cover love that'll never last.
So doubling our vocal harmonies, again, I would opt to do that by actually doubling them up during the recording process. But if we don't have that, we can always opt for a doubling plugin. There are plenty of them. I prefer the doubler from Waves, but you can use whatever you like, of course. And that leads us right into tip 5, which is doubling the lead vocal. And so you see here in the verses, I have a single vocal. I left this one here just to show you how I would go about comping. But then in the chorus, I have doubled vocals right here. and then I have doubled vocals right here. And I have doubled tracks because there's a little bit of an overlap. If there wasn't an overlap, I would have these two doubled tracks collapsed together, but that is not the case for this. So let's listen to the vocal going in and then the vocal during the chorus. And actually what I'm going to do is mute all of these background vocals so we just have the lead vocal to focus on.
My friends see that I'm last. I cover love that'll never last. See you while I'm walking around. I hope I don't see, I hope I don't see you. See you while I'm walking around. Such a small town, such a small town now. See you while I'm walking around.
Versus just having a single vocal.
See you while I'm walking around. Hope I don't see, I hope I don't see you. See you while I'm walking around.
With double.
Such a small town, such a small town now. See you while I'm walking around.
Some people really love doubled vocals and use them all the time. Other people don't like them at all. You can see here that I like having one more so lead vocal and then another one mixed underneath it. I don't often mix two of them at the same level, but it is a very important technique to at least be aware of and to experiment in your music production endeavors. It's the phase differences in the waveforms. If we actually zoom in, we can see the differences between them that make the doubling effect really special. We could get away with just some delay or just some detune, but even when there is modulation in those effects to kind of shape up or change up the differences of the differences in the phase between the two signals, it's still just not the same as actually having a true double track. And I think that it sounds really great when used appropriately on vocals. So sometimes when I have a important line, I'll use a bit of doubling. Other times, like in this song, I will use doubling on the chorus versus the verse. So doubling in the chorus, single vocal in the verse. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can utilize this, but understanding vocal doubling and how it sounds and how you can use it can really help strengthen your toolbox for music production, especially when it comes to vocal production. Next up, tip 6, we have vocal tuning, and I won't go too far into it. I do have a dedicated video to my go-to plugin for vocal tuning, that is Celemony Melodyne. That video is going to be linked in the description box down below if you'd like to check it out. Of course, you can use Auto Tune or Waves Tune or Flex Pitch if you're using Logic. I prefer to use Melodyne. And much like the vocal line, this does have ARA, whatever the Intel mode is on Mac. So I have to transfer or arm and then record audio into Melodyne. So let's have a quick look at this. I'll just do a few lines for the last verse here.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Need is not the root.
So now we have this recorded into Melodyne, and the first thing I'll typically do when recording is to make sure that everybody's in tune, or at least their instruments are in tune. That is to A440, so that when I come in here, I can select lines at a time and then make this bigger. Go up here to pitch center, center those 100% so that they are at the actual centers of each of these notes, which are denoted by these rows right here. So if it's at the center, it's perfectly in pitch. And then these red lines in the case of Melodyne are the actual pitch, and then these blobs sort of act as words or syllables. And so we have some pitch editing tools right here, the pitch tool, the pitch modulation tool, and the pitch drift tool. Pitch tool can help us to move or adjust the pitch itself. Pitch modulation tool can help us to reduce the amount of vibrato or modulation of the pitch. And then the pitch drift tool is really good if we have long held notes that are either drifting flat or sharp. We can utilize the pitch drift tool to flatten them out over time. And so I would just go through and listen to one line at a time and work the magic with Melodyne here.
Don't need a reason to love.
So maybe I would reduce the modulation in this one, for example.
Don't need a reason to love.
And that one too.
Don't need a reason to love.
Maybe that has to go down a little bit.
Don't need a reason to love. Don't need a reason to love. Don't need a reason to love.
So that sounds good. Then I would go to the next one right here, select that, go up to pitch center, center it all, Move on to the next line.
Like the seasons and stars above.
There's a lot of vibrato right there. I might actually take that down just a little bit. It is part of the style of this vocalist, so I don't want it to be too far off. I also want to make it sound as natural as possible, and so I don't do a lot of heavy-handed tuning.
Like the seasons and stars above.
That's good. Move on to the next one. And again, just going through and working in small chunks.
Rather this like it is.
Go up here, pitch center that.
Rather this like it is.
And I like working in chromatic mode. You can work in a certain key if you want. That can be shown up here. And then when you would go to adjust the pitch, you could actually snap to chord scale. I don't like doing that personally. I prefer to work in chromatic mode, but that's just personal preference. And oftentimes there will be repetition in the performance of the note, at least in the melody. And so we can go over here and reference what was done previous. And this one seems a little bit flat to me. What I can actually do is separate this note, double click, and then treat them as separate notes here. So maybe I'll bring this one up to F, just to make it look a little bit more like this one.
Rather this like it is.
What would happen if I brought that up to F?
Rather this like it is.
I think that actually sounds better. What if I go all the way up to F?
Rather this like it is.
Yeah. And I would go through and do this for each of these. And then it's kind of a slippery slope. Once you do the tuning on one track, you are definitely going to want to go through and do it on all of the other tracks. Now, when it comes to background vocals, we can get a little bit more aggressive with our tuning, as is the case with pretty much any other processors, because the background vocals aren't going to be drawing too much attention to themselves. The main focus is going to be on that lead vocal. And so we want to be a little bit more precious about the lead vocals. And like I was saying, we can be a little bit more aggressive with the background vocals if we need to. So in addition to tuning, I would also go through and time all of these as well to taste in order to fit the overall vibe of the song. The great thing about Melodyne is that it doesn't have any inherent sound to it. So if you were to transfer or record stuff into it and not do anything within the plugin, it wouldn't automatically tune anything for you. It would output effectively what's going into it. It's only once you start messing about with the different notes, with the timing, with the tuning, that it actually outputs something different than what is being inputted. So we are halfway through the tips here. If you're finding this video useful thus far, I would highly encourage you to hit that like button. It really helps out small channels like this one on YouTube get recognized and get out to more people. So I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right, tip number 7 now is everybody's favorite, compression. And we can go super hard on the compression or very light or even not use compression at all. But knowing how to use compression on vocals is super important if we want to get the most out of our vocal production and to be able to work on as many different genres and as many different vocals as possible. And so one of my go-to compressors for vocals is the Waves CLA 76. This is an emulation of the 1176 from Chris Lord-Alge. There are 2 revisions. Blackie is a little bit less aggressive. Bluey is much more aggressive. And you can actually go up here and there are presets that you can start from. A lot of people like to stay away from presets. And I used to be like that, but I'm not so precious about it anymore. So I can go here to Rock My Vocal, for example, and just have a good starting point for a vocal. So we can listen to what this sounds like and make some adjustments from there. Let's actually turn Melodyne back on just for fun. So we have Melodyne going into the 76 here.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is.
So we're slamming it there.
Stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love.
And so that just helps to really solidify the level of the vocal. If we push the level ahead of everything else in the mix, as we normally would in a mix, the vocal's often the lead element, and then we compress it, then it will make that vocal stand out that much more. It's an interesting process because if we mix something very quiet in the mix and very behind in the mix or very deep in the mix, compression could help push it even further. But if we have a vocal that is up front, then using compression, especially FET style compression, in my experience, will help it really sit at the front of the mix. And it's just a super useful process for making the lead vocal in particular sound like the lead instrument of the mix. So here it is once again.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is.
And without.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above.
It's definitely up front,
Rather this like it.
but then once we put the compressor on, we're pretty well level matched. The compressor might be a little bit louder, but not by much. But just having that compression there really brings the vocal out and makes it sit up front.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is.
And it doesn't sound over compressed to my ears. Maybe I'm just used to really compressed vocals, but the ratio is all the way in, so that's really slamming with a really high ratio. It's almost as if it's limiting, and any peaks in the vocal signal get brought down so that there's less dynamic range. That's how compressors work. So it helps to really make a more consistent level for the vocal, but then it also brings out some of that nuanced information because we're bringing down the peaks and then we're adding some makeup gain. So the low level stuff, that more nuanced material inside the vocal, of which there is a lot because it's a very expressive instrument, can be brought out that much more in the mix. And so that's a more subtle part of using compression on particularly lead vocals, but it is something to be aware of. Let's have a listen in solo here without.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above.
On.
I'd rather this like it is, and not be stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love.
And I'm just really applying that gain reduction and compressing on the higher notes. The lower level notes aren't receiving much, if any, gain reduction, so I'm not actually compressing them. And it's at that point where I think the sweet spot for most vocals lies, in my opinion. Again, you can use compression however you like on your vocals or anything within your mixes. I can only give you my opinion, but I think it's a super important process to understand on vocals, and it can really help bring out the nuance in a vocal as well as make it sit that much more presently in the mix. And so it's a super important vocal production tip I have to share for you, is just using simple downward compression on your vocal. Tip number 8 I have for you sort of piggybacks on compression. It's a very similar process, and that is fine-tuned automation, especially of the levels of the vocal. And so I will often do this after compression if I do happen to be using compression on a vocal, which means that I will typically, in the case of Logic Pro, go down here to Utility and utilize a gain plugin so that I have some gain control after this compressor right here. Alternatively, I would just use the fader and automate the fader, but in this case, I can use the gain control. And what I will do is open up the automation lane. It's a hotkey A in the case of Logic. I'll go to Latch, and I will actually do this in real time as much as possible to just ride the vocals a little bit, make them a little bit louder where I think that they need a bit more accentuation, make them quieter when it may be a little bit too loud. Again, compression is going to try to do this automatically, but I like in many cases to actually go in and fine tune this with some subtle gain automation or fader automation depending on the circumstance. And so let's have a listen back here, and I'll just run through quickly.
Don't need a reason.
I'll be sure to unsolo that. Let's start off with a little bit extra gain on the don't need a.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love,
Get a second chance.
like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids.
Just a little subtle automation there. You see it's almost barely perceptible, but just to help add a little bit more nuance to the vocal here. I realize that technically this is counterintuitive. You see I am reducing the dynamics or the level variation of the vocal right here, and then I'm going through and automating a level control afterward. So those are kind of at odds with each other. I'm taking away dynamics and then putting in new dynamics. But I've found that whether we use both of these together or either one of them in the mix, they can be valuable tools in vocal production, and so I wanted to share both of those in this video. Again, I may not necessarily use compression and gain automation or fader automation on the same track, but I will often utilize both of these techniques whether they are on different tracks or different subgroups, perhaps some compression on the lead vocal and then some subtle fader automation on a lead vocal bus, and then more volume automation on the background bus or individual background channels. But two very important techniques to understand and to utilize in your vocal production in order to get better results, in my opinion. And still on the topic of compression, I have tip number 9, which is parallel processing. And that is true of both compression and saturation and other processes for that matter. And so to set this up, I would utilize a send. I'm just gonna turn off the automation or set it to read. and I'll actually bring this gain plugin back here. And then I would send this to a bus. Let's just send to bus 32. I'll send that over at Unity. I'll go over here and grab bus 32, call that PC Vox, so parallel compression Vox, create a track for it. And now on this effects return, I'm going to add some compression. Usually my go-to compressor for parallel compression is the Waves SSL channel, which emulates the G master bus compressor right here. It even looks like it. And parallel compression acts effectively as upward compression. So we are applying downward compression where we're taking the peak level and bringing it down in order to reduce the dynamic range on the actual effects return channel, this PC Vox channel right here. But then when we mix that back in with the original dry signal, the dry lead vocal in this example, then we have a situation where we are adding the PC vocal to that and the peaks have been reduced. And so we are adding more to the lower level signal than we are to the very peaks because the peaks have been dropped by this compressor right here. And so in effect, we are bringing up the lower level signal and decreasing the dynamic range that way versus strictly bringing down the peak level signal. And so it's a slightly different style of compression. It helps thicken things up and helps give more weight and gravitas to a vocal. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like in the context of the mix. I'm really gonna slam this vocal right here. I'm gonna have relatively fast attack times and release times in order to do that. So let's have a listen.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above.
Really crushed.
I'd rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is.
So there is going to be some extra level that comes about from having parallel compression. Of course, we are adding level to the mix, but listen very carefully. I'm just going to bring it in subtly underneath the lead vocal, just to how the vocal kind of thickens up. So I'll start all the way down here and I'll bring up the fader until it's too much and then back it off.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love.
And so you heard there that it helps thicken it up just a little bit. It is pretty subtle. I think that's partly because this lead vocal is compressed to begin with. So if I took off this compression and then brought up some upward compression, I think that we would notice it a little bit more in the mix.
Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above.
There we go.
Rather this like it is, not be stressed about having kids. Don't need a reason to love, like the seasons and stars above. Rather this like it is.
So again, there is some level gain there and we are susceptible to the loudness bias. So something that's louder may not necessarily be better, but we'll often perceive it as being better. So we do have to be careful whenever we're running any parallel compression of that fact. But you heard there that especially when I took off the compression on the lead vocal, the downward compression, that the reduction in the dynamic range when I brought up this parallel compression fader really helped to thicken up that vocal and even push it a little bit forward in the mix. Once again, without.
Don't need a reason to love,
With.
like the seasons and stars above.
And so I would experiment with using just parallel compression, just downward compression on the actual vocal track itself, particularly on lead vocals, and then also with using them together with some downward compression on the vocal and then also some parallel compression after the fact. I'm trying to give you a nice toolkit of different vocal production tools that you can then combine together in order to get better results in your mixes, but I would highly encourage you to try them all out, figure out what works best for you in your genres, and what works best together versus what works best when it's separated in different tracks. And so I did mention a little bit about saturation, so let's axe this compressor and actually look at some saturation. For this one, I'm going to not go to my go-to, which is the FabFilter Saturn II. Let's actually try out the Decapitator from Soundtoys. So this is a distortion or saturation plugin. Let's have a listen to what it can sound like on the vocal. I'm just going to solo this PC Vox. Perhaps I should call it PS Vox because it's parallel saturation at this point, but
Don't need a reason to love.
You hear that,
Like the seasons and stars above.
that distortion?
I'd rather this like it is.
So that sounds a little bit too distorted, but again, we are going to mix that underneath the lead vocal, and so we can get a little bit more aggressive, kind of like how we can get a little bit more aggressive with our background vocals because they are not the focal point. We can get a little bit more aggressive with our compression or our parallel saturation on the parallel channel. So let's listen to this in the context of the mix.
Don't need a reason to love. Like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is. Not be stressed about having kids.
Off,
Don't need a reason to love.
on,
Like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is.
and it almost gives us a sort of analog warmth, even though we're really driving this pretty hard on the parallel channel. When we mix it, especially this low, it just gives a little bit more character to the vocal. And I think that it's a super useful process to have in our toolbox as we produce our vocals. Moving on, we have a very special process, and that is de-essing. I'm actually going to mute this parallel channel for the time being. And de-essing, I do have a video on that as well. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. But it's effectively a very special type of narrow band compressor. We can actually achieve a similar result with a multi-band compressor. I'll get to that in a second. But it's a special type of compressor that acts solely on the sibilance range of the signal. So I'm gonna go up here to FabFilter, open up the Pro DS. This is again on the lead vocal for the verse. I don't need my automation open. And so if we look at this plugin, we have a range right here. And sibilants, to be clear, are those harsh frequencies when we make the S sound or the T sound or Z sound. And if they are untreated in the mix, they can be very harsh, they can be very distracting for the mix, and they can fatigue our ears. And so they typically happen between about 6 to 10 kilohertz. So let's set this just briefly right there. And what a de-esser will do is it will focus on this range right here, in this case between 6.3 kilohertz and 12.6 kilohertz. And it will act like a typical compressor. So when that particular range gets too hot, or when there's a lot of sibilant harsh energy, the Pro DS will decrease the signal either just in that band if we are in split band, or in the entirety of the signal if we are in wideband. And so in that way, we can effectively reduce the sibilance, reduce the harshness of the vocal in the mix. And if you want professional sounding vocals, you pretty much have to use de-essing nowadays. It is one of the most important processes we have for vocal production and vocal mixing. And if you want to learn a lot more about de-essing, I do have that video I talked about, but I'll just show you the basics of it in this one. And so let's actually start by auditioning the range right here. So reason. You can see the yellow pieces right here. That's where there's some sibilant energy. All right, let's go to split band right here so that we are only ducking within that sibilance region that we just defined right here. And then much like a compressor, I'm going to drop down that threshold until we get some gain reduction. And then this range right here tells us the maximum gain reduction that can happen. So we don't want too much reduction, especially in the sibilance range. It can make a vocalist sound like they have a lisp. But we do want a little bit just to subdue the harshness that may otherwise be there. So let's have a listen right here and I'll just dial it in.
Don't need a reason to love. Like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is. And not be stressed about having kids.
So you see the gain reduction meter up here.
Don't need a reason to love. Like the seasons and stars above. I'd rather this like it is.
So just some subtle gain reduction right there. I'm only taking away 4 dB. At this point in the mix, the vocal isn't all that harsh to my ears. It may become that way if I'm adding more air with EQ in the top end, or really driving it hard with compression, or even with saturation. But at this point, I think that this is sufficient for de-essing. And while we are on the topic of de-essing, I should also add in a sort of bonus tip I have for you, and that is de-plosifying. So a plosive is another problematic area when we are performing vocals into a microphone, where anytime our mouth closes and then opens, like on a P or a B or even a D or a K, the K would be in the back of the throat, the B would be at the lips. there's a little burst of air that could hit the microphone and cause it to overload. This is often dealt with at the tracking or recording stages with the use of a pop filter or positioning the mic a little bit off axis or a little bit far from the vocalist, just to avoid having that air hit the microphone and overload it. But it does sometimes happen in vocals. I'm not sure if there's any particularly bad plosives in this vocal take right here, but let's quickly have a listen and try to look for one.
And not be stressed about having kids. Need is not the root. Shouldn't feel like a tap. Cupboard love never ever lasts.
So I don't think there is.
Saturday and I'm home.
That's a particularly bad sibilance though right here.
Saturday.
So if we go down to the de-esser, we may have to be a little bit more aggressive on that.
Saturday and I'm home.
Maybe even bring that down.
Saturday and I'm home.
That brings it down a little bit more.
Saturday and I'm home.
Yep.
But now it's me and I'm kid. You always said I was friends, see that I'm left. I cover love.
So there aren't any real big plosives in this vocal.
Bad at being alone. And so I stare at my phone. Better than what I...
But let's say that this B right here was particularly plosive. We could, in some instances, actually automate the volume right here so that we are getting rid of that overload.
It's better than what I think.
And then in the context of the mix, you probably wouldn't even notice that quick drop down.
It's better than what I think. It's better than what I think.
Again, there's no plosive there, and so we don't need this, but I'm just showing you different strategies if you did happen to have a big B and an overload of the mic. And another thing we could do that is more similar to de-essing is we could actually get a dynamic EQ. Let's go to Fab Filter Pro Q3 here, which does have an option for dynamic EQ. You just right click this and then make dynamic, and we can bring down the dynamic range if we'd like. And then we would go through and try to find where that plosive energy is. It's often in the low end.
Better than what I think. It's better than what.
So maybe right here, and then utilizing dynamic EQ, once that plosive, which actually isn't existent in this mix, this is again just an example, once that plosive energy would come up, the dynamic EQ would actually kick in and reduce just in that frequency range right here.
What I think. Things that push me to drink. I'm scared.
So if we were to go back here,
Bad at being low. Bad at being.
on top of that, we also have de-plosive plugins. And I actually just thought of this tip right now as we were talking about de-essers. This was not actually part of my plan for this video. I would have 13 tips if it was. But if we go up to iZotope, actually, they have in their RX10 bundle, I just have the regular bundle. They have this de-plosive plugin right here, which you can actually insert. I would probably put it right at the beginning or maybe right after the gain. And then we can adjust the sensitivity, strength, and the frequency limit, or the highest frequency to attenuate of potential plosives to help reduce them in the mix. And iZotope's plugins are absolutely insane at being able to restore audio. So I would have full confidence in recommending the RX10 de-plosive if you have particularly bad plosives in your audio, particularly on your vocals. All right, moving on to tip 11 I have for you, and that is adding some subtle delay or reverb or both, and that is generally done using effects returns. And so I'll go back down to my sends right here, and I'll just send to 16 and 17 for the sake of this demonstration. I will send those at Unity. That's the way I like to do it. You could also adjust your send level and then have these faders up. I usually like to have these faders down and send at Unity, but you can do whatever you like. Let's create those tracks. Over here, let's call the first one Vox Verb, the second one Vox Delay, and these ones are right here. Let's drag them up right below the lead vocal that is feeding them. So we have our verse right here being sent to bus 16 and 17, bus 16 and bus 17. So in terms of reverb, you can use whatever you like. I really like plate reverb lately on vocals, and so I'll show you a little bit of that. If we go to Sound Toys, they've got a really nice EMI 140 emulation called the Little Plate right here. Super easy control, and it just sounds great. We've got a low cut. I'll bring that up a little bit Because it's an effects return, I'm gonna have this all the way at wet, and I'll just have maybe a 2-second delay. It is a pretty upbeat song, and so I don't want the decay to be too long. And just for the hell of it, I will put on the mod control right here to add a little bit of subtle modulation. And so with the little plate up, let's send some audio to it from this verb, and we will adjust this in the mix to get some reverb on the lead vocal and hear how it sounds.
Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone. It's better than what I think.
Without it,
Things that push me to drink.
so it just helps to add a little bit of space to the vocal. It gives it a sense of depth and width within the overall mix. Once again.
Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone.
And what I like to do with my vocal reverbs is I actually like to EQ them. I'll just bring up the channel EQ, the stock one from Logic, and I'll usually go somewhere in the so-called muddiness range where there's a lot of first harmonics and fundamental frequency content of a lot of different instruments within the mix. And just if I can bring this down in a few of my effects, notably my reverbs and my delays, I can just help to clear out a little bit of that muddiness. And I find that it really helps to open up the mix and reduce that clutter that could otherwise make other instruments in the mix not be that bright or not be that separated within the mix. It's just something that I picked up, and I usually opt to do it within my mixes. In the actual little plate here, I do have a low cut filter engaged, and so I don't feel the need to actually do anything with the high pass there, but I could otherwise bring this up in the EQ as well.
It's better than what I think.
Very
Things that
subtle.
push me to drink. I'm scared to say the least. Well aware of my mortality.
And then another thing I really like doing with my vocals is actually doing some sidechain compression. I have a video going into detail on sidechain compression as well. I'll leave a link to that in the description box. It's all sort of connected. And I'm just gonna go to the Dynamics tab and open up the stock compressor from Logic. If I just need some quick sidechain compression, this is really all I need. I'm gonna go to my sidechain up here, go to Audio, choose Vox Verse 3_2. Right here. So now the lead vocal right here is going to act to control this compressor, and the compressor or the gain reduction is going to apply to the vocal reverb. And when I set things up like this, whenever the vocal is actually present in the mix, the vocal is actually sounding, then the reverb will be ducked down and it won't get in the way of the vocal. And then when we have space between the vocal, like right here, that will allow the reverb to swell up a little bit and fill up that space and still give a strong sense of reverberant space within the mix without cluttering up the vocal all that much. So I did a little bit of cleanup with EQ, and now I'm doing even more cleanup with sidechain compression. So let's turn off auto gain. I'll bring this up just 4:1 ratio to start off with and have a listen and dial in the compressor here.
So I stare at my phone. It's better than what I think. Things that push me to drink.
And I'll actually add a little bit of decay here because there is quite a bit of space between the vocals, even though it is a pretty upbeat song. So let's have a listen here.
Things that push me to drink. I'm scared to say the least. Well aware of my mortality. Well aware of my mortality. I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my.
And I'm gonna bring that release up in time so that the compressor takes a little bit of time to swell that reverb up.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door. See you while I'm walking.
I think that that's appropriate for this verse if I wanted to use some reverb, and I think it sounds pretty good. Again, a little bit of plate reverb, a little bit of cleanup, especially in the muddiness range or those low mids with some EQ, and then some sidechain compression just to push the reverb out of the way when the vocal is actually present. I can do something very similar with some delay. I really like just the stock delay, the stereo delay from Logic, and I like setting this up with a certain delay time, and so I'm going to turn off tempo sync. I like 180 milliseconds on the left and 220 on the right, and I like this to be a little bit bandpass, so I'm going to get rid of some of that very low end. That way I don't really need to use any EQ to clean up those muddiness frequencies. And I don't need a whole lot of feedback, I don't think. Output mix at 100%, of course, because we are utilizing an effects return. And I'll just bring down the high cut a little bit don't need all of that high-end energy in a delay. And now I can mute the vocal reverb so that we can focus directly on the delay. And let's also sidechain compress the delay here.
Gotta be low, so I stare at my phone. It's better than what I think.
And so delay to me is just a cleaner sort of reverb. That's how I'll often use it when I am using it for space. Reverb is nice and lush and works really well in sparser mixes. And then when we have denser mixes like this one, the delay, I find personally, acts to give a stronger sense of space without muddying up as much of the mix, because it's very short, it's very succinct according to the audio that is feeding the delay. And so once again, we can have a listen.
Things that push me to drink. I'm scared to say the least. Well aware of my mortality. I guess.
And we could actually add in a little bit of feedback in the stereo delay right here, just to give a little bit more of a tail.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door.
And so you can make up your own mind about whether you would prefer delay or reverb. We can also use both of them together. That would sound like this.
It's better than what I think. Things that push me to drink.
And alternatively, we could run our vocal delay into the reverb. For example, we could have the output of the delay rather than going to the stereo output. We could route that into the reverb. And so in this case, we have, I'll bring up the mixer. The lead vocal right here is being outputted to bus 4. That's the vocal bus. It's being sent to bus 16 and bus 17. That is the reverb and the delay right here, respectively. And then the reverb is just being sent directly to the mix bus, while the delay right here is being sent to the vocal reverb. And so the lead vocal is being sent to the verb, and then it's also being sent to the delay, which is also being sent to the verb. And we can even now mute bus 16 send from the lead vocal and have the vocal run from this send into the delay through to the vocal reverb and then to the mix bus. So there's a whole bunch of different routing stuff that we can utilize to run delay into reverb, reverb into delay, run them in parallel, and whatever else we really want on the mix. We could even, if we really wanted to, put the delay or the reverb directly on the lead vocal right there. I personally wouldn't recommend that. Then you have to deal with wet, dry mixes and all of that. I think that there's a lot more control with effects returns, and I have a video on that as well. But that is just all to say that the options are pretty much limitless. So here's what, for example, the lead vocal into the delay, into the reverb would sound like.
I'm scared to say the least. Well aware of my mortality. I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door.
And you saw there that I had to really crank this up because the level coming out of this vocal delay is a lot less than the level coming from this send right here. But again, vocal delay and vocal reverb are two incredibly important effects to utilize, particularly when we are sending them to effects returns and we have independent control over them, just to give a sense of dimensionality to the all-important vocal within the mix. And now tip number 12 I have for you for your vocal production is to utilize vocal throws. And on that note, I have the bonus tip of also utilizing ad-libs. So let's start with ad-libs actually, and that is what I've been muting down here. I don't know if there's too many ad-libs necessarily in this mix. And so this maybe isn't necessarily an ad-lib, but it is a background vocal that happens between one of the lead vocals. And that's kind of what ad-libs act to do. Those are the little phrases and lines that are used in between the main vocals of a performance. You often hear that in hip hop and rap music as a way to back up and emphasize certain lines within the main part of the vocal. So this is technically a harmony and a background vocal, but it kind of acts like an ad-lib.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door.
So that harmony right here kind of acts as an ad-lib.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things.
It's just backing up that main part of the vocal right here. They don't always have to be the exact same line, and they especially don't have to be harmonized, but they are an interesting way to add to the overall vocal production of a song. So that's another one that I just thought of as we were making our way through this, so I don't have a 14th tip for you. And I don't actually have a real proper example of an ad-lib in this track, but I figured I would mention it anyway. And so back to the main tip, which is utilizing effects throws. These are situations where instead of sending to a delay or a reverb, for example, the entirety of the mix, we are only sending to a special effect for one syllable, one line, a few lines, or just a small section of that vocal. And so for example, we will often use this on the last line of a verse or a chorus. So I could, for example, utilize this reverb to show you how to set this up.
The thing's knocking at my door.
So let's bring this down a little bit. And now to have an effects throw, let's actually bypass both of those. I'm going to open up my automation and bring this down a little bit. Then I'm going to go to the verse right here. I'm going to go to my automation tab. I'll go into main in the case of Logic Pro, and then I'm going to go to send absolute, and I'm only going to send to, in this case, the vocal reverb for this line only. And I can even make it ramp up. And so I am not sending, not sending, not sending, not sending. And then in this line, I'm going to throw to that reverb. The reverb is going to give me something back, and then we are out of it. So just for this little bit, that's where I'm throwing to the reverb. So let's turn this back on and have a listen here.
I guess I'm prone to ignore. The things knocking at my door. See you while I'm walking around.
So you heard that reverb kind of ramp up underneath this line, and then it lingered, because it is a time-based effect, into the chorus. Once again.
The things knocking at my door. See you.
And then what's more is I can actually come to this vocal reverb now, and I can actually mute it right as that chorus starts. So just a little bit of extra production here for you. Right at this bar 21, I will have that die out. Now if we listen to this in solo, I'll start right here so that you can hear it completely dry.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door.
So I'm throwing to the reverb right here, and then the reverb return right here, I'm actually muting as soon as we get into the chorus. In the context of the mix, this is what this sounds like.
I guess I'm prone to ignore the things knocking at my door. See you while I'm walking around.
I could do something very similar right here with the delay. Let's go to send in the main 2, send 3 vocal delay, absolute. And let's just do the entire line right here. I'm not going to ramp up. I'll bring that down. You could also do this with mutes and unmutes. I'm opting to use it with volume, but I can actually show you how we could go about doing that. Main, send vocal dry, mute. And so right here, I will make sure that it is muted after the fact, mute it before the fact, and then unmuted for just this line. And then that way I can go back here to the actual send amount and actually get rid of this automation. So I suppose this is more so a true vocal send where we are muting and unmuting. I'm just going to set this to unity if possible. Yeah. So opening up this automation, send mute 3 vocal delay. If we are in this section of the song, we see that this is unmuted. And then if we are in this section of the song, we see that it is muted. So let's turn up this vocal delay and maybe choose something a bit more obvious for the delay. Let's go to the Arturia Brigade. This is my go-to analog delay plugin. And I'm going to turn up the feedback and make sure that this is at perhaps a quarter note right here. I'm going to make sure that this is actually being outputted to the stereo output rather than going into a muted Vox verb.
My friends see that I'm lax. I cover love that'll never last.
And so this is just a very simple example along with the previous example, but it is something that we can do just to add a little bit more interest to the vocal production. Using vocal throws is something I love doing, and I'll actually go through and spend a lot of time throwing to this and that. It doesn't necessarily have to be delay or reverb. It can be to different octave effects. It can be to different modulation effects or whatever your heart desires. Different distortion or saturation, for example. Whatever you want to throw to just for a short period, for a syllable or a word or a line, and then to get out and move on with the rest of the mix. So in the context of the mix, this is what this delay could sound like.
My friends see that I'm last. I cover love that'll never last. See you while I'm walking around.
So I wouldn't actually use that in the mix, but again, just an example to get you thinking about what you could use for your vocal effects throws. All right, that is my 12 or 14 tips, whichever way you'd like to look at it. Let's now hop out of Logic Pro. All right, so there are my 12 tips for better vocal production. I hope that they prove useful for you in your music production endeavors. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can click on that, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send it to you right away. It goes through my entire framework of mixing to help you make the right decisions at the right times to improve your mixes. If you'd like to spend more time with me here on YouTube, there are another few videos worth checking out, I think, in the top left and right corner. And if you like the way I put together these videos to share information on mixing and music production, I would invite you to subscribe to the channel here. It really helps out small channels like this. So I hope to see you in the next video, and I'd like to thank you once again for being here with me. Until next time, cheers.